he was pretty much executed. He had walked right up to the window of that vehicle, which had gone through a fence, and fired several rounds through the front passenger window before casually walking off. Just walked off. This is the tragic story of Martz Hurt, a 28-year-old rapper, entrepreneur, and devoted father whose promising future would be violently ripped away on a quiet Monday morning in October 2020. On the morning of October 26th, at precisely 8:30 a.m., Martz would be gunned down in cold blood in a seemingly peaceful suburban neighborhood in Missouri City, Texas. The man responsible for this senseless murder was Matthew Rand Jacobs, the ex-husband of Martz's wife. Jacobs had been lurking outside her home, waiting with a loaded weapon. What kind of dark jealousy had been festering inside Jacobs? Were there warning signs that could have prevented this devastating tragedy from unfolding? When Martz confided in a close friend, he mentioned that Jacobs had been following him to his house. He said, "Man, he knows where I live." His friend, concerned for his safety, advised, "Monty, you need to leave the girl alone." Before we dive deeper into the shocking details of that fatal morning, let me take you back to where it all began in 1992 in Washington, D.C., where Martz's incredible journey started. Martz Hurt wasn't born into privilege. Growing up in a low-income community in Washington, D.C., young Martz faced challenges that would break many before they reached adulthood. But Martz possessed something extraordinary, an indomitable entrepreneurial spirit that refused to be extinguished. He had a drive, a hustle that would earn him the nickname Money Martz. As a teenager, Martz displayed an extraordinary work ethic and business acumen. He started by selling sodas and bottled water to anyone who would buy them, turning a simple hustle into a profitable venture. But this wasn't about pocket change, it was about survival. It was about proving that he could make something out of nothing, no matter the odds. Martz had bigger dreams, however. He recognized that education was his ticket out, his path to transform his circumstances. At just 17, Martz accomplished something incredible. He secured $150,000 in scholarships to attend Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, FAMU, in Tallahassee, Florida, where he would study criminal justice. But Martz wasn't content to simply be a college student. Music had always been in his blood, and he knew he could use it to inspire others facing similar hardships. At FAMU, he balanced his demanding criminal justice studies with his growing rap career, using music as a platform to motivate others and tell his story. He adopted the stage name Money Martz, perfectly capturing his hustler mentality. His mixtapes chronicled his journey from poverty to possibility. In 2013, he released Bosses, which stood for Built on Self-Success. This wasn't just typical rap music filled with violence. It was positive, motivational hip-hop, offering a message of hope to young people that success was possible. Martz's unique sound quickly gained recognition. By 2014, he was performing at FAMU's legendary Homecoming, sharing the stage with heavyweights like Kendrick Lamar, Juvenile, Currency, and Bobby Shmurda. From selling sodas on street corners to performing alongside Grammy-winning artists, Martz had shown the world the power of relentless pursuit. His friend James Ganight described him as having a "I can't stop, won't stop" attitude, the true spirit of a man who refused to accept limitations. Martz's ambitions extended far beyond music and academia. He sold his CDs nationwide, accumulating thousands of views on YouTube and building a following through relentless networking. His social media presence reflected his dual identity as both a rapper and entrepreneur, constantly sharing motivational messages and business insights. After graduating from FAMU, Martz relocated to Texas in search of new opportunities. Friends from Houston convinced him that the Lone Star State offered the fresh start he needed. His family described him as a jokester, a lover of travel, and someone whose infectious personality drew people to him wherever he went. In Texas, Martz met Aries Davis, a woman with a past that included a tumultuous marriage to Matthew Rand Jacobs. Martz and Aries began dating approximately a year before his tragic death, and their romance was immediately overshadowed by her ex-husband, who had clearly not accepted the end of their marriage. The warning signs were impossible to ignore. Matthew Jacobs and Aries Davis had a documented history of domestic violence. In March 2020, Fort Bend County deputies responded to 3 separate domestic violence calls involving Jacobs and his ex-wife. 3 calls, 3 separate incidents where law enforcement had to intervene. But the situation became even more disturbing. Martz's friend, Ronald Vaugh, revealed a chilling detail. "I think the ex-husband put a tracking device on her car or her phone. He'd pull up sometimes when they were hanging out at night, and he'd send pictures of her car parked outside." Matthew Jacobs wasn't just angry. He was actively stalking his ex-wife and her new boyfriend. He was tracking their movements, showing up uninvited, and sending menacing pictures, a clear sign of predatory stalking behavior, one of the most dangerous warning signs of impending violence. Martz's aunt, Marlene Hurt Ackham, pleaded with him to end the relationship. She sensed the mortal danger that was closing in. When he told me that the guy followed him to his house, he said, "Mom, he knows where I live." I told him, "Mart, you need to leave the girl alone." Martz was fully aware of the threat. He knew that Matthew Jacobs knew where he lived. He knew he was being stalked. Tragically, Martz had committed to ending the relationship before that fateful day, but he would never get the chance. But tragically, it wasn't soon enough. October 26, 2020, began like countless other Mondays for Martz and Aries Davis. They had spent the early morning at Martz's best friend, Ronald Vaughn's home, completely unaware that these would be Martz's final hours. Ronald had no reason to believe that his casual "see you later" would be his last words to his good friend. When Martz left his best friend's house that morning, Ronald never expected it would be the last time they would speak. Yeah, when Martz left his best friend's home earlier this morning, he said, "Hey, I'm going to see you maybe later on today." But now, he is devastated by the loss of his good friend. Matthew Jacobs had been planning his attack, monitoring Aries' location through whatever tracking device he had planted, biding his time like a predator. Around 8:30 a.m. that fateful morning, Martz and Aries drove to her home in the Sienna neighborhood of Missouri City, Texas, in the 2500 block of Amethyst Isle Lane. It was a beautiful, upscale subdivision, where families raised children and where violent crime seemed almost impossible. It was the kind of neighborhood where you'd never expect an execution-style murder to occur, especially not in broad daylight. But Matthew Ron Jacobs was already there, already in position, already armed and ready to carry out his murderous plan. Deputies later confirmed that the suspect had actually been waiting in the neighborhood for his ex-wife and her boyfriend to return to the area. When they did, Jacobs made his move. Can you imagine the terror of that moment? Martz and Aries pulling into what should have been the safety of her home, only to be met with a nightmare in an instant. According to Fort Bend County Sheriff's Office reports, the sequence of events unfolded with terrifying speed. As Martz pulled the vehicle up to Aries' home, Jacobs made his move. Aries managed to exit the SUV first, a split-second decision that would save her life, but couldn't save Martz's. As she stepped out of the vehicle, Jacobs approached and opened fire, targeting Martz, who was still seated in the driver's seat. The violence was swift. Jacobs fired multiple shots through the passenger window, each bullet ending Martz's life. Gunfire shattered the peaceful Monday morning. Residents, who had been preparing for their day, were thrust into a nightmare as they heard gunshots echo through their streets. One neighbor heard 2 initial shots followed by screams and then more gunfire. Mortally wounded, Martz attempted to drive away, survival instincts kicking in, but the injuries were too severe. He lost control of the vehicle, crashing through a neighbor's fence into their backyard. "Dominique, now that this cul-de-sac is open without crime scene tape, I wanted to give you a lay of the land," a local said. So, the shooting happened near this home. This is where the couple pulled up when deputies say the ex-husband was outside of the home waiting. We know that some shell casings were removed from this area, and we're told that the boyfriend who was driving and behind the wheel lost control of the vehicle. You could see some of the skid marks and went straight through that fence. And that is where he ended up losing his life. Far from his family in Washington, D.C., 28-year-old Martz Hurt took his final breath, cutting the corner in the cul-de-sac and driving through the fenced-in area, at which point the suspect or the ex-husband approached the vehicle and fired several rounds into the driver's side window. Martz was pronounced dead at the scene. Martz Hurt, who had overcome poverty, shared stages with hip-hop legends and inspired countless young people, was gone, snuffed out by jealousy and obsession. But what happened next was chilling. After executing a man in broad daylight, Matthew Jacobs didn't panic. He calmly walked back to his vehicle, weapon in hand. Neighbors watched in horror as the murderer casually left the scene. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was calculated. Jacobs had waited outside Aries' home, knowing they would return. He brought a weapon. He positioned himself strategically. This level of premeditation makes this crime all the more disturbing. The Fort Bend County Sheriff's Office immediately launched a massive manhunt. Helicopters circled above, K-9 units searched the area, and the community locked down, terrified that a killer was loose. After 3 hours of searching, Matthew Ron Jacobs turned himself into Missouri City Police and was charged with murder. Investigators spent 8 hours processing the scene, documenting evidence, shell casings, and bullet holes. They noted the extensive damage caused by the gunfire just moments before, as the victim's vehicle had been removed from a neighbor's backyard. The damage was devastating, the driver's side and front window completely shattered. Jacobs had no intention of fleeing. Surveillance footage captured the chilling images of his approach, his actions, and his calm departure. The evidence was overwhelming. As news spread, the community was rocked by the loss of Martz. This was a young man with everything to live for, his dreams snuffed out by jealousy. This is all a surprise. This is a deep one. This one is going to hurt a lot of people, said Ronald Vaugh, devastated by the loss of his best friend. This wasn't just the loss of a friend. This was the loss of a visionary who had touched the lives of so many. Fort Bend County had been experiencing a rise in domestic violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. Martz's murder was part of a disturbing pattern, one of 24 domestic violence-related deaths in Harris County in 2020, compared to just 17 in 2019. The Fort Bend Women's Center had assisted nearly 600 survivors year-to-date, a testament to the overwhelming challenges that arose when stay-at-home orders made seeking help difficult. As Martz's family received devastating news in Washington, District of Columbia, his aunt, Marlene Hurt Ackham, who had previously warned him, now faced a reality worse than her darkest nightmares. "I can't believe it," she said, her voice filled with anguish. Marlene Hurt Ackham says she hasn't slept in the last 24 hours. What was he thinking? At that moment, the pain rippling through Martz's family was immeasurable. This was the violent theft of a young life full of promise, taken in an instant. For those who knew him best, the tragedy was compounded by the overwhelming knowledge that this death was preventable. Marlene Ackham revealed how close Martz had come to escaping this fate. Just 1 week before his death, Martz had promised her he would end the relationship with Aries. 1 week. He had promised her, "Last week I'm going to leave." Tragically, it wasn't soon enough. Martz had posted on social media that Monday morning, "You deserve all good things life has to offer." Less than 1 hour later, he was dead. Martz had died over 1,000 miles away from his family in Washington, D.C. In his absence, his cousin, Mara Hurt, organized a GoFundMe campaign to help with funeral expenses and to repatriate his remains. Martz was remembered as a jokester, someone who loved to make people laugh and build relationships. He was the kind of person who brought joy to others but found himself entangled in a dangerous situation where another man's inability to let go would cost him everything. Marlene expressed the frustration that families of domestic violence victims often feel. What explanation could suffice? What words could make sense of gunning down a 28-year-old man in broad daylight? She demanded, "He owes us an explanation. You're going to go out there, walk to his car and shoot him like that?" Court records from the divorce proceedings painted a picture of a troubled marriage. The March 2020 domestic violence calls represented a clear pattern that should have raised more red flags. There had been a physical altercation between Martz and Jacobs months before the shooting, demonstrating the escalating obsession. Then came the stalking. Jacobs had placed a tracking device on Aries's car, sending photos of her vehicle, constantly monitoring their movements. These were textbook warning signs, recognized by criminologists as precursors to lethal violence. Martz's tragedy highlights the systemic failures in addressing domestic violence. Despite 3 documented calls in March 2020, clear evidence of stalking, and a physical altercation, Matthew Jacobs was able to carry out his plan without any significant intervention. Local domestic violence organizations emphasize the importance of recognizing danger signs and how crucial it is to take action. "It is dangerous when you leave," they warned. "Your right to be scared is valid, but we are here to help." The most dangerous time for victims is when they attempt to end the relationship. The perpetrator's sense of control is threatened and violence escalates. This is exactly what happened. Martz and Aries were moving forward with their lives, but Matthew Jacobs couldn't accept his ex-wife's new life. Social media tributes flooded in, revealing just how deeply Martz had touched the lives of those around him. An Instagram post from Miss Baz captured the emotion perfectly. "Damn bro. This underscore hurt me. You will go down as the most hustling underscore I ever met. If it was sold, Martz had it. Damn, you didn't deserve to go out like that. Rest in heaven, money-making Martz." Another memorial from DMV Ripon News stated, "Rest in peace, Martz, hurt." Matthew Rashawn Jacobs was charged with murder and held in Fort Bend County Jail. The evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance footage, witness testimony, and forensic evidence confirmed his role in the crime. However, for Martz's family, no verdict would ever bring him back. What makes Martz's story all the more heartbreaking is the contrast between what was and what could have been. His music, still available on platforms like Apple Music, Spotify, and Boomplay, reflects his philosophy and hustle. His 2013 mixtape, Boss, built on self-success, was a manifesto for success rooted in self-reliance. His music videos such as We Get High, filmed in Atlanta, showcased his versatility and commitment to his craft. We get high. We get high every day, the lyrics said, echoing his relentless drive. I get high a day just to ease the pain. I was out at the bus stop when it was raining. All I knew in my life was keep maintaining. Couldn't be around people who had my energy draining. Had to focus on my goals. Focus on my goals. Couldn't focus on you. Martz left behind a young child who is now fatherless. That child will only know their father through stories, photographs, and music, never experiencing his humor, guidance, and love firsthand. Feel me, dog? Martz used to say. What we got to get, big dog? This cash, right? You feel me, big dog? You got to get this money, man. Yeah, I got to get this money. You feel me? You feel me? Big picked up. That's the only way we're going to eat out here. That's the only way we're going to survive. Getting this money. You know what I'm saying? You my dog. Domestic violence ripples across generations, and the impact of Martz's death is something that will continue to affect his family for years to come. As of 2025, Matthew Rashawn Jacobs is serving a life sentence for his crime. He will spend his years behind bars, his freedom taken away just as he took Martz's life. The question now is whether Martz should have left Aries when he first noticed her ex-husband stalking them. Should he have left the woman, knowing how dangerous the situation had become? Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Click on one of the cards on your screen to see more videos like this. That's when Jasmine Lovett and Roby Anderson welcomed their first baby, a daughter named Aaliyah Sanderson. At the time, Jasmine and Roby weren't married and they were both pretty young. Jasmine was in her early 20s, and by all accounts, she was a strikingly beautiful woman. But as with many relationships, things weren't as perfect as they may have seemed on the outside. After Aaliyah was born, cracks started to show in Jasmine and Roby's relationship. According to reports, Roby began coming home later and later, leaving Jasmine alone with their newborn. Then things took a turn for the worse when he started showing up drunk or high. That behavior only escalated, and soon Roby was becoming more aggressive. One day, Roby came home, and things quickly escalated when he aggressively demanded money from Jasmine. She was terrified for her safety and ran into the bathroom to call the police. By the time the police arrived, Roby was gone. And since Jasmine hadn't been physically harmed, they told her there wasn't much they could do at that point. However, Jasmine managed to get an emergency protection order against Roby. But just 13 days later, the order was revoked after Jasmine and Roby claimed they had worked things out. They told authorities they didn't need the order anymore, though the details of what happened between them during that time remain unclear. What we do know for sure is that Jasmine and Roby eventually split up, and Jasmine got custody of Aaliyah. After the breakup, Jasmine and Roby managed to keep things relatively civil. They focused on co-parenting and tried their best to maintain a peaceful environment for their daughter despite the challenges of their past. Keep in mind that this all took place in 2018. And during all the emotional turmoil, Jasmine found solace in her family, whom she was very close to. Reports mentioned that Jasmine was especially close to her mom and sister. They often gathered for family dinners, and she kept them updated on everything happening in her life. After months of navigating heartbreak, Jasmine decided it was time to start putting herself out there again. So, she joined a few dating sites in hopes of meeting someone new. And it wasn't long before Jasmine met Robert Lemming, a man who seemed to meet her high standards. At the time they met, Robert was 34 years old, about 10 years older than Jasmine, who was in her mid-20s. While the age gap wasn't huge, it was still noticeable. Robert was originally from the United Kingdom but had moved around a lot as a child due to his father's military career. This constant moving made it hard for him to form lasting friendships, an issue that continued into his adult life. Despite his struggles with socializing, Robert found a way to connect with others online, where he felt more comfortable. He loved chatting in online forums and meeting people without the pressure of face-to-face interaction. It was actually in one of these chat rooms that he met his first wife, a Canadian woman who was studying to become a teacher. They married in 2013 and Robert moved to Canada to be with her. They had a son together, but unfortunately the marriage didn't last, and by 2017 they had separated. Robert's ex-wife received full custody of their son, with Robert only having supervised visitation. Although Robert and his ex-wife were no longer together, He stayed in Canada thanks to his permanent residency status, which he had earned through his job as a heavy goods vehicle mechanic. After his marriage ended, Robert, like Jasmine, turned to dating sites where he dated several women before finally meeting Jasmine. Now, their whirlwind relationship began in September of 2018. And just a month later, Jasmine and her young daughter Aaliyah were moving into Robert's home. It was a bold step, one that raised eyebrows, especially with a child in the mix. Moving in after only 1 month of dating is fast by most standards, but for them, it seemed like the logical choice at the time. Financially, it made sense. Sharing a home meant cutting costs in half, something many people can appreciate in today's economy. Unlike a roommate setup, living with a partner offers more than just a practical split of rent. There's someone to help with groceries, chores, and in Jasmine's case, childcare. With no job at the time, Jasmine relied on child support from her ex while dedicating herself to raising Aaliyah. Having Robert step in to help with Aaliyah must have been a welcome relief. And help he did. Robert was more than eager to pitch in. Whether it was cooking, cleaning, or watching Aaliyah while Jasmine ran errands, he seemed to embrace his new role wholeheartedly. His love for Aaliyah was obvious. He treated her like his own. And for Jasmine, that made all the difference. From the outside, things looked perfect. Jasmine's family thought so too. She remained close to her mother and sister John Hovey, frequently meeting them for family dinners. When Robert began joining these gatherings, her family welcomed him. He seemed kind, attentive, and genuinely invested in Jasmine and Aaliyah. But not everyone was entirely on board. John Hovey, always protective of her sister, couldn't shake her unease. The relationship was moving too fast for her liking. And while Robert's care for Aaliyah and Jasmine was clear, John Hovey couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Then came April 14, 2019. A family dinner like any other. Jasmine, Robert, and Aaliyah joined the usual gathering. But this time something was off. John Hovey couldn't help but notice that Jasmine and Robert seemed distant, a little more reserved than usual. It was subtle, but enough to make her wonder. Still, the dinner ended without incident, and the sisters even made plans to meet again on Good Friday, April 19th. But when the day came, Jasmine never showed up. No call, no text, nothing. This was completely out of character. Jasmine was someone who always kept her commitments, especially with family. As the hours passed and there was no word from Jasmine, John Hovey began to worry. She reached out to their mother and tried to get in touch with Jasmine, but her calls went unanswered. Something wasn't right. Jasmine had always been reliable, and the fact that she hadn't shown up or even contacted anyone was deeply concerning. John Hovey's concerns grew with each passing hour. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened, something that had caused her sister to break her usual routine. By late evening, John Hovey became frantic and contacted the authorities, fearing something terrible had occurred. But what could they do without concrete evidence of a crime? Jasmine's absence lingered in the air, casting a shadow over the family that no one could explain. As the night wore on, John Hovey and their mother spent the evening in distress, hoping that Jasmine would turn up at any moment. But as the hours dragged on with no word from her, the family's worst fears began to materialize. Something was terribly wrong, and it became clear that the cheerful, dependable sister who would always show up for family events was now missing, and they had no idea where she was. Genevieve's worry grew with every unanswered call and text. She even tried messaging Jasmine on Facebook, but her messages weren't just ignored, they were marked undelivered. Unable to shake her concern, Genevieve drove to Jasmine and Robert's house that evening around 5 p.m. The basement light was on, a sign that someone had to be home. She knocked on the door. No answer. She rang the doorbell. Still nothing. She waited, knocked again, and even tried peeking inside, but the house remained eerily silent. With no way to reach her sister, Genevieve left, hoping she was just overthinking things. 2 days later, on April 21st, Jasmine's mother, Kim, decided to visit the house herself. Like Genevieve, she was met with silence, knocking, ringing the doorbell, nothing. It was all futile. But as she prepared to leave, Kim noticed something strange near the front door. 2 pairs of sneakers. One pair was freshly cleaned, still soaking wet, and placed neatly by the entrance. Though her mother hadn't received any response, she left a note on the front door of Jasmine and Robert's home. It was probably a message urging them to get in touch, hoping that either Jasmine or Robert would finally respond. But the days went by and still there was no word from Jasmine. By April 23rd, 4 days after leaving the note, the family's concern had reached a boiling point. Jasmine had missed several planned check-ins, and on this day she was supposed to meet her mother and sister for another family dinner. This dinner was a long-standing tradition for the family, and missing it was something Jasmine would never do. Despite the growing worry, the family still clung to a small thread of hope. Maybe something had come up. Or maybe there was a misunderstanding. But as the hours ticked by and Jasmine didn't show up, that hope began to fade. This was the moment that everything shifted for Genevieve. She was beyond worried. The feeling that something was terribly wrong weighed heavily on her, and she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her gut. So, she decided to go to the police station and file a missing persons report. She was determined to do whatever she could to help find her sister. She handed over her phone, answered every question the police had, and provided a full account of everything she knew about Jasmine's life in recent months. Initially, detectives considered the possibility that Jasmine had left voluntarily. However, Genevieve immediately dismissed the idea. Her sister would never abandon her family, especially not without contacting someone, least of all with her young daughter, Aaliyah, left behind. Jasmine was deeply devoted to her child and her family. Disappearing without a trace simply wasn't in her character. Investigators also turned their attention to Jasmine's ex, Roby, wondering if he might be connected to her disappearance. Genevieve clarified that while Roby was no longer involved in Jasmine's life, he had relinquished his parental rights to Aaliyah, which meant he was no longer obligated to pay child support. While this had added financial strain on Jasmine, there had been no indications of lingering conflict between them. After investigating further, police ruled him out as a suspect. However, when the detectives began looking deeper into Jasmine's relationship with her current partner, Robert, they found themselves uncovering a much more complicated situation than they had initially imagined. Back in December of 2018, Jasmine had confided in her sister John Hovey about the troubles she was facing with Robert. Their relationship was strained and they had actually broken up. However, they decided to continue living under the same roof as roommates. It was an unusual arrangement, especially considering there was a toddler in the house, but Jasmine explained it as a practical decision. Moving out with a toddler is not only difficult but also costly. She justified it as a temporary solution, hoping they could figure things out. And just a few weeks later, Jasmine told Genevieve that they had reconciled and decided to give their relationship another shot. However, the troubles didn't end there. Jasmine revealed another personal detail to her sister that added yet another layer of complexity to the situation. During their period of separation, she had become pregnant. But instead of continuing with the pregnancy, Jasmine made the difficult decision to terminate it. The emotional weight of that choice seemed to linger, and it was unclear whether it played a role in the breakup, their reconciliation, or in something deeper that was affecting their relationship. As time went on, financial stress began to build. With Roby no longer providing child support for Aaliyah, Jasmine found herself carrying the full burden of providing for both herself and her daughter. While she hadn't yet secured a job, she was determined to find work. In fact, Jasmine longed to return to the workforce, not just for financial reasons, but also to feel productive and to have more interaction with other adults. She even admitted to feeling jealous when Robert left for work each day while she stayed behind to care for Aaliyah. She longed for the independence and sense of accomplishment that a job would bring, but the pressure was mounting. Robert, on the other hand, seemed increasingly withdrawn. His attempts to keep things together, helping around the house, bonding with Aaliyah, showing affection, began to feel more forced. Jasmine's unease grew, but she remained hopeful, believing they could work through their issues. However, her concerns started to outweigh the comfort she had found in their shared life. There were moments when Robert's behavior seemed unpredictable, and Jasmine found herself second-guessing his motivations. As days passed, Jasmine began to feel more isolated in the relationship. Despite Robert's efforts to step in as a father figure to Aaliyah, Jasmine sensed a growing distance. The emotional toll was becoming evident, and she found herself questioning whether they were on the same page or whether they had simply fallen into a routine that no longer brought them joy or peace. And with every passing day, the weight of uncertainty grew heavier. Despite all this, Jasmine continued to fight for stability, for her daughter, for herself, and for the semblance of normalcy she could provide in a world that had already shown its darker side. But little did she know that the breaking point was closer than ever. Something was about to shatter their fragile equilibrium. The next chapter of Jasmine's life was about to take a devastating turn. Genevieve's account convinced detectives that this wasn't a case of Jasmine simply running away. Something else had happened to her, and the police wasted no time launching a full-scale investigation. Within days, they pieced together a timeline of events leading up to her disappearance. As mentioned earlier, Jasmine and her daughter Aaliyah were last seen at a family dinner on April 14th, and everything seemed perfectly normal. On April 15th, CCTV footage captured them at a local grocery store. Jasmine appeared calm and collected as she paid for her groceries at a self-checkout, with Aaliyah peacefully nestled in her stroller. The following day, April 16th, was when the first hint of something troubling began to unfold. Robert dropped Aaliyah off at daycare at precisely 7:12 in the morning. Everything appeared fine as usual, but things took a strange twist later in the day. At 4:46 p.m., Robert returned to pick up Aaliyah, but there was a problem. He wasn't on the authorized pickup list. This wasn't a small detail. In order to take Aaliyah home, Robert had to call Jasmine, who then had to personally authorize the daycare staff to release Aaliyah into his care. While this was certainly unusual, it wasn't the most alarming part. What happened after that was Jasmine and Aaliyah would never be seen or heard from again. Days went by without a trace. Then on April 18th, an odd clue surfaced. Jasmine's credit card was used to place a food delivery order, but the authorities couldn't confirm whether Jasmine herself had placed the order or if someone else had gained access to her card. Still, it was clear that whoever had used it was still connected to her in some way. By now, the focus of the investigation had shifted to Robert. After all, he had been the last person seen with both Jasmine and Aaliyah. Genevieve, Jasmine's sister, had already told the authorities about the tension in Jasmine and Robert's relationship, their breakup, their reconciliation, and the strain they were under. This information made Robert an even more important person of interest. It seemed fair to question him, especially considering all the recent turmoil in their relationship. So, on April 24th, the police decided it was time for a welfare check at Robert's home. What happened next was strange and unsettling. The officers knocked on the door, but no one answered. They knocked again and again. It was like a game of Groundhog Day, repeated knocks but still no response. Then the officers noticed something strange. The note that Jasmine's mother had left on the door just days earlier was still there. It was almost as if it had been waiting for them. But that wasn't the only odd detail. The front door's window, which had previously been clear, was now covered with something that looked like cellophane, the kind of clear plastic used to wrap gifts. It was the only window on the door that was covered, and it completely obstructed the view into the house. This made it impossible to see what was happening inside. The officers kept knocking, rang the doorbell, and waited. The atmosphere was tense, like something was being hidden. While waiting, one officer noticed a wet trunk liner lying over the air conditioner, seemingly drying out. It was obvious the trunk liner had been recently cleaned. In addition, the garden hose had been unwound, which suggested it had been used to rinse something down, likely the trunk liner. This observation immediately brought to mind the sneakers Jasmine's mother had seen earlier, which had been soaked and washed. A lot of signs were pointing to a cleanup, but what was being hidden? Then, as they continued to observe, they realized something. This house hadn't been abandoned. Someone had been there cleaning and moving things around. The only problem was that the police couldn't get inside just for a welfare check. The locked door and the covered windows left them with no easy way in. But the officers weren't ready to give up. They decided to get creative and called the fire department. With the help of a ladder truck, they managed to peer into the windows of the upper floors, hoping to catch a glimpse of something that could give them more information. Unfortunately, they saw nothing through the windows. But as soon as the fire truck arrived, the lights inside the house flickered on, and moments later, Robert opened the front door. Of course, the officers questioned him, and his response? Well, take a look at this. I was sleeping. I sleep with plugs in. And hey, we've been here for hours and hours and hours now. Hey, banging on your door and ringing the doorbell. I've been drinking and smoking a lot. So, when the officers pressed him further, asking, she's not with her sister? Robert replied, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, that makes sense. The officers, now even more suspicious, asked, why does that make sense? He responded, 'cause I haven't heard from her either. At this point, the officers knew they needed to dig deeper. They asked Robert about Jasmine's car, and he explained that she didn't drive. That seemed odd considering she was a grown adult and should have some means of transportation. They also noticed the note on the door that Jasmine's mother had left behind, but Robert claimed he had no idea about it. The situation was becoming more bizarre with each passing moment. The officers were growing increasingly suspicious of Robert's behavior. His responses were erratic, and his story didn't seem to add up. It was now clear to the detectives that Robert's behavior and actions were raising several red flags. His erratic responses, the odd details about the house, and his strange demeanor were becoming increasingly hard to ignore. They couldn't shake the feeling that Robert was withholding something important, something crucial to the investigation. The discovery of the wet trunk liner and the covered window pointed to a clear attempt to hide something, But what exactly was he hiding? The officers were convinced that Robert was involved, but they needed concrete evidence to prove it. As the days continued to drag on, Genevieve and Jasmine's family couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. Every day that passed without any solid leads or answers only deepened their fear for Jasmine's safety. Where was she? What had happened to her? And how was Robert involved in all of this? The questions weighed heavily on everyone, and the more the police uncovered, the more it seemed like Jasmine's disappearance was tied to a tangled web of lies, secrets, and possibly a more sinister motive. Detectives knew that if they didn't act fast, they might lose the chance to uncover the truth. They weren't going to let Robert off the hook. The investigation was far from over, and the mystery of what happened to Jasmine Lovett and her daughter Aaliyah was just beginning to unfold. But what they would uncover next would change everything, leaving them to wonder how far Robert would go to cover up the truth. To stay updated on this case and follow the twists and turns, be sure to stay tuned to Bruised Voice for more updates and in-depth stories like this. The front door had been barricaded with 2 long poles, and as mentioned earlier, the window was covered in cellophane. Multiple spots on the walls had also been sanded down and cleaned. Inside, they found more oddities: a plastic hammer filled with sand, boxes of blue moving blankets, and a gun safe packed with multiple guns and boxes of ammo. But what stood out most was a partially melted firearm part, infant toys, Jasmine's prescription bottles, and even her shredded passport in his trash can. But wait, there was something even stranger. They found raw strips of bacon scattered all over the house, thrown about like it was some sort of bizarre breadcrumb trail. One piece of raw bacon was found draped over a dining room chair, another in the garage, and yet another in the room with the furnace. As if that wasn't strange enough, an empty bacon package was sitting idly in the kitchen. What was the significance of the bacon? Was it a sign of something deeper, or was it just part of Robert's erratic behavior? It added another layer of mystery to the already bizarre scene. Despite all the bizarre findings, there was still no sign of Jasmine or Aaliyah. It was as though they had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only traces of their presence in the house, but nothing substantial enough to indicate their whereabouts. Meanwhile, Robert was out there giving interviews, adamantly claiming that he had nothing to do with Jasmine and Aaliyah's disappearance. He appeared calm and collected, but his words didn't seem to match the mounting evidence against him. "You were kind of the primary suspect in this homicide investigation. You still are. What are your thoughts about that? And what are your emotions right now? What's kind of going through your head?" a reporter asked him, his tone pressing for an honest response. "It's very stressful," Robert replied. "But I hope they will be found, and I hope we can move forward from this. No, we were friends. Absolutely friends, and supported each other. I would like, obviously, for them to be found and for me to be cleared of this," he said with a nonchalant shrug, though his voice betrayed the tension he felt. His response was far from convincing. "Your relationship with Jasmine? Good. I mean, were you a boyfriend, girlfriend, or?" the interviewer pressed. "No, just good friends. Nothing alarmed me until, of course, I got arrested," Robert replied, his words more defensive than reflective. The whole situation seemed to unravel further when Robert, in an odd tone, mentioned that he had been drinking and smoking a lot lately. "I've been drinking and smoking a lot," he admitted. "So, yeah, she's not with her sister. What does that mean?" "Well, that's the reason we're here." The police had already been gathering information about Robert's erratic behavior, and his demeanor only served to reinforce their growing suspicions. His story was inconsistent, and his responses seemed more like a man trying to justify himself than someone truly concerned about the whereabouts of his missing girlfriend and her child. It was clear that something was off, but they still needed more evidence to make a solid case against him. As the investigation unfolded, someone close to Robert came forward anonymously. This person revealed that Robert had a reputation for being a loose cannon and behaving erratically, which further fueled the detectives' suspicions. They believed this new information fit the pattern of strange interactions they'd already had with Robert. He seemed to have a history of impulsive and unpredictable behavior, which now appeared to be a dangerous combination in light of the current investigation. Still, without concrete evidence, the police couldn't move forward with an arrest. So, they decided to try a new strategy. On May 5th, 2 undercover officers approached Robert on the street near his home. Remember, Robert had been talking a lot about how his life was falling apart, how he had lost his job, how his friends had turned on him, and how he had no one to turn to. It seemed like this was exactly what the police were hoping for, because as soon as the officers started talking to him, Robert began to open up. The undercover officers kept complimenting him and boosting his ego, telling him they believed he was innocent. This flattery seemed to have an impact on Robert, making him more willing to talk to them. At one point during their conversation, the officers even told Robert a fabricated story. They claimed that while the police were investigating his house, one of his neighbors had stolen evidence from the scene and given it to them. This wasn't true at all, but they hoped it would make Robert trust them more. They continued to manipulate him, suggesting that he meet them for a beer where they could talk about destroying the evidence together. Robert, clearly feeling lonely and vulnerable, agreed to meet up with them. But even though he seemed to be opening up, he was still a bit suspicious of the officers. He even asked them multiple times if they were really cops or if they were just trying to trick him. The undercover officers reassured him each time, convincing him that they weren't law enforcement. They continued their act, telling Robert crazy stories about how they were part of a criminal group, a gang with a lot of experience in illegal activities. They painted a picture of how bad the police were and how much they could help Robert. They even gave him advice on how to stop the cops from suspecting him, all while playing into his insecurities and fears. Eventually, the officers invited Robert to their so-called warehouse, which they made sound like some kind of secret hideout where they kept all their illegal weapons. Robert, desperate for someone to talk to and willing to take any support he could get, agreed to go with them. When they arrived at the warehouse, the officers showed him a collection of guns, hoping to make Robert believe they were dangerous criminals. Seeing the weapons seemed to trigger something in Robert. He began to feel like he could trust these people who had been feeding him all these stories, so he started opening up more. He talked about his life, his struggles, and his fears. And as he spoke, the officers quietly recorded everything, knowing they were finally getting closer to the truth. The investigation had now taken a crucial turn. With Robert's confession starting to unravel, the police were finally gathering the evidence they needed to make a move. They had cracked open Robert's defense, and now it was only a matter of time before they would uncover the full extent of his involvement in Jasmine and Aaliyah's disappearance. To stay updated on how this case unfolds and to follow the investigation step by step, be sure to stay tuned to Bruised Voice for in-depth coverage and more shocking twists in this story. He told them that when he and Jasmine were dating, he had cheated on her. He justified it by saying, "Every single guy does that." While this is clearly not true for everyone, it gave the officers even more insight into his mindset and character. According to Robert, Jasmine had wanted to get married, but he didn't, and this caused a lot of tension between them. As the conversation continued, Robert opened up even more. Despite only meeting these two officers 5 hours earlier, he confessed in detail, almost as if he were seeking validation or sympathy. He didn't clearly explain how he had killed Jasmine or her daughter Aaliyah, but he did share disturbing details. After killing them, Robert used his phone to find a remote area to dispose of their bodies. He chose Bragg Creek and drove there to check out the surroundings. He said he waited until the next day to hide the bodies, taking them to the woods near Bragg Creek. Once there, he buried them and drenched them in gasoline. Although he didn't burn their bodies, his hope was that the smell of gasoline would confuse the cadaver dogs and prevent them from finding the remains. Robert's efforts to cover his tracks didn't stop there. He told the officers that he had also set up a makeshift fire pit to burn Jasmine and Aaliyah's personal belongings. Items like Aaliyah's car seat and other possessions were burned, all to make it look like Jasmine had simply taken her child and run away. Robert even went to the extent of covering the bodies in mulch because he believed the mulch would help mask the scent and confuse the cadaver dogs further. What struck the officers most was Robert's obsession with throwing off the cadaver dogs. He had bacon all over his house, and it wasn't just because he liked the smell of the meat. Robert explained that he had heard pork smells similar to human flesh, so he figured that the bacon would distract the dogs, preventing them from detecting the bodies. His plan seemed well thought out, almost like he had studied how to evade detection. He even commented on his old car, joking that if it had been a newer model, the police could easily track his movements. But since it wasn't, he felt like he had outsmarted them. And get this, Robert agreed to show the officers where he had hidden the bodies. So, in the middle of the night, they drove to Bragg Creek, and Robert led them to the exact spot where he had buried Jasmine and Aaliyah. The bodies were wrapped in blue moving blankets, buried under dirt, sticks, and mulch, not far from the makeshift fire pit. The fact that Robert brought the officers to the scene was chilling, as it showed just how proud he was of his actions. Many killers return to the scene of their crimes or keep mementos, and Robert seemed to take pleasure in showing off what he had done. The information Robert provided was more than enough for the police to arrest him immediately. The Calgary Police Department held a press conference soon after, but they didn't disclose all the details right away. DNA evidence confirmed the worst. The bodies found were those of Jasmine and her young daughter, Aaliyah. Jasmine had suffered brutal blunt force trauma to her head, with the added horror of a bullet wound behind her left ear. Aaliyah too endured savage blows, one to each side of her head, another to her back, and a spinal injury that made the fall theory impossible. Both deaths were ruled homicides, giving the authorities the green light to pursue murder charges, no longer just manslaughter. On May 7th, Robert's fate took a darker turn as he was officially charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. While the prosecution briefly considered pushing for first-degree murder charges, they ultimately concluded they couldn't prove premeditation, but they were confident second-degree murder would be their focus, and they aimed for a solid conviction. As his trial unfolded in October of 2021, Robert's defense took an unexpected turn. He pled guilty to the murder of Jasmine but insisted almost callously that he had nothing to do with Aaliyah's death. Robert's defense team painted a chilling picture of what they claimed happened on April 17th. They argued that Robert had picked up Aaliyah from daycare and brought her home to an empty house. Jasmine was nowhere to be found. He and Aaliyah played together, watching her favorite show, The Wiggles. At some point, she wandered upstairs toward the kitchen, but tragically, she slipped and fell backward, hitting her head. Robert claimed she got up quickly, appearing fine. So they continued their evening, eating dinner and watching TV. Later, Robert put Aaliyah to bed, went outside to smoke a cigarette, and made himself a drink. Jasmine came home around 7 o'clock, and at about 9 o'clock, she went upstairs to check on Aaliyah. What she found was every mother's nightmare. Her daughter wasn't breathing and was unresponsive in her bed. According to Robert, Jasmine immediately flew into a rage, accusing him of killing Aaliyah. But that accusation set Robert off. In a fit of anger, he said he grabbed a hammer and struck Jasmine repeatedly until she collapsed. To make sure she was truly dead, he then retrieved a gun and shot her. The story only worsened from there. Robert, in a macabre attempt to cover his tracks, wrapped Jasmine's lifeless body in a blue moving blanket, then used a towel to clean up the blood. He tossed the towels away, made himself another drink, and went to bed. Over the next several days, he buried their bodies and burned anything that might have tied him to the crime. The grisly details of his actions came to light as the prosecution pieced together Robert's movements, his manipulations, and his disturbing obsession with hiding the truth. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The brutality of the murders, his attempt to cover them up, and his chilling behavior in the aftermath made it clear that Robert Lemming was responsible for the deaths of Jasmine Lovett and her daughter, Aaliyah. His trial would continue to unfold, but one thing was clear: Robert had crossed the line from manipulation to cold-blooded murder. Stay tuned to Bruised Voice for more updates on the case and other chilling true crime stories as we continue to uncover the dark and twisted truths behind these tragic events. However, the autopsy told a much darker story. The injuries to Aaliyah's head and spinal cord were far more severe than any fall could explain. The evidence was too clear. This wasn't an accident. Additionally, medical examiners claimed that Aaliyah had injuries to her genital area, suggesting possible harm in that part. This revelation led prosecutors to believe that when Jasmine returned home on April 17th, she caught Robert in the act. Fearing that Jasmine might expose what she had discovered, Robert reportedly killed her to silence her. In a panic, he then killed Aaliyah, fabricating the story about her accidental fall down the stairs to cover his tracks. This theory seemed to align with what Jasmine's family had said about Robert's behavior, how he doted on Aaliyah, picking her up, cooking for her, and spending time with her in a way that raised suspicions. Although many might argue that a good step-parent can show care for a child, Robert's excessive interest, especially in light of the medical examiner's findings, seemed more than just ordinary affection. What's particularly striking is that Robert never denied killing Aaliyah during his conversations with undercover cops. Instead, he framed it as an accident. Prosecutors argued that had Aaliyah's death been truly accidental, Robert would have been eager to make that clear, especially considering how horrific the idea of killing a child is in court. They pointed out that Robert never once said that he didn't kill her. Instead, he stuck with the story he had told from the beginning. Robert himself took the stand as the sole witness for his defense, repeating the same account. Aaliyah had fallen down the stairs, hit her head, and died in her sleep. But his excuse didn't hold up, especially when it came to the claim that he couldn't call for help because he couldn't find his phone. In reality, Robert had his phone with him the entire time. Plus, authorities were able to track his text messages, including one sent to his mistress just before the killings. Despite these inconsistencies, Robert waived his right to a jury trial, allowing the judge to decide his fate. The judge found him guilty of second-degree murder in Aaliyah's death, stating that the injuries were not accidental and that Robert had intentionally caused harm. The judge also pointed out that Robert's actions, drinking and smoking after the murders instead of seeking help for Aaliyah, showed a clear lack of remorse. Robert was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 22 years. Jasmine's family was satisfied with the sentence, though they acknowledged that no amount of time would bring Jasmine and Aaliyah back. The family also found solace in knowing that their loved ones' legacies would live on through their charitable efforts. They raised $25,000 for the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter and started a memorial scholarship in Jasmine's name to help other women who have survived domestic violence. In 2022, Robert appealed his conviction, arguing that the medical examiner couldn't rule out an accidental fall causing Aaliyah's fatal injuries. However, the appeal was rejected. On July 23, 2024, his conviction was upheld. As for Jasmine and Aaliyah's families, they continue to honor their memories by raising awareness about domestic violence and supporting those affected. But many people felt that the sentence wasn't enough. With only 20 years and the possibility of parole, some believed it was too lenient given the brutal and calculated way he took their lives. It definitely sparked a lot of debate. So what do you think? Was the punishment fair considering the severity of the crimes, or do you think he deserved a harsher sentence? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So, make sure to drop a comment below and let's talk about it. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more Bruised Voice. Thank you once again for watching.